And even though there's not a lot of people here, it will be recorded. And so people that couldn't come to the conference can watch it afterwards.
Yep.
Betsy, whenever you're ready.
Hi, welcome. I'm Betsy Brenner. I'm so happy to be here today and be included in this important conversation on mental health. Sometimes eating disorders are left out of the conversation, and I am grateful to be here today and share non-clinical information about eating disorders and also details of my own story. I'm someone with lived experience, not a clinician, and I have a lot to share today. And I hope that if there are any questions, you'll feel comfortable asking. I love answering questions. First of all, just a little bit about me. I am the author of The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife. My memoir was published a year ago, and it is a journey that I tell in detail my life history through the 2020 pandemic. My memoir was actually a silver lining of the pandemic. I was given the gift of time to put my life story into words. I never planned on being an author. I'd written my recovery story to share at treatment centers in New England, but I'd never thought about seriously writing a book. But my memoir, now that it's been published for a year, has given me both the framework and the platform to talk about eating disorders in a variety of settings with a variety of audiences. And it gives me a framework for discussing eating disorders and what they're all about and my own recovery journey. So I'll just tell you that there are two purposes in writing my memoir. One was to help myself heal on the deepest level possible. And I'm grateful to say that I have. I'll always be a work in progress. And that is the message of my memoir, that it's never too late to be a work in progress. It's never too late to heal from past trauma, no matter how long ago it was, and become healthier in mind, body, and spirit. The other purpose of writing my memoir was to give hope to and inspire others along their own recovery journeys. I'm grateful to hear from readers around the world. Literally every single week, I get emails of someone who thought they were the only one suffering or the only one who couldn't recover. And it's so meaningful on a very deep level to give hope to others so that they too know that recovery is possible. It's not easy. There are no shortcuts. If there were, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So before I get into the details of my own journey, I want to take a few minutes to talk about eating disorders in general. Again, I'm not a clinician, but I want to share some important facts about eating disorders that are well known in the field, but may or may not be well known among others. And there are certainly national organizations with detailed information and access to clinical information and treatment. One clear misconception many people have is that eating disorders are about food. They, in fact, are not about food. It's the behaviors with food that are the symptom of the disorder. Eating disorders are brain-based, serious psychiatric illnesses with a genetic component, biological component, psychological, environmental, very complex psychiatric illnesses with actually the second highest mortality of all mental illness behind opioid abuse. I'm going to say that again. Eating disorders have the second highest mortality rate of all mental health illnesses. So a most upsetting statistic is that every 52 minutes, someone dies as a direct result of an eating disorder. But yet eating disorders are often left out of the mental health discussions. The most common eating disorder is binge eating disorder, though most people are more familiar with anorexia and bulimia. I will tell you that another misconception is that you can tell by looking at someone that they have an eating disorder. Well, I'm here to tell you that eating disorders don't discriminate. They come in all shapes and sizes, people of all ages, genders, colors. Eating disorders do not discriminate. Before I was diagnosed, I had these preconceived ideas that to have anorexia, you had to be a young white female. And that is simply not the case. Someone could actually be in a very large body and still suffer from anorexia. Eating disorders do not discriminate. I will also say that nobody chooses to have an eating disorder. It's not an issue of vanity. It is a serious psychiatric illness. I can't say that enough times. Eating disorders are never a choice, but recovery is a choice. It's a long, complex journey to healing, but recovery is possible. Often there are many twists and turns along the way. Recovery is never linear. Relapse is common. There are going to be steps backwards and forwards, big steps and little steps, but recovery is possible. Full recovery from an eating disorder is possible. Recovery requires professional treatment. Almost no one can do this alone. Because of the complexity of eating disorders, they often require an interdisciplinary treatment team, usually including a therapist, a dietitian, a primary care physician, and often a psychiatrist. I will tell you that peer support is a wonderful adjunct to the professional treatment team, never a replacement for professional treatment, but I am fortunate to provide peer support, mentoring, support groups, because I think so many people, even when they're in the midst of treatment with their professional providers, I think connecting with someone who truly gets it is essential to the recovery process, and feeling that connection with someone who has lived experience. This is the case in any sort of mental illness. And it's very empowering for me to provide that peer support. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to recover. And to provide that support and connection to others is very meaningful. Eating disorders often co-occur with other mental health conditions. I myself have suffered from anxiety and mild depression. It is very rare that you'll find someone with a diagnosable eating disorder who does not also suffer from a co-occurring mental health condition. Often anxiety or depression, but it could be any number of other co-occurring conditions. The most well-known and common eating disorders, and I'm not going to go into the details of each one, but the most common ones that people have heard of are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and ARFID, which stands for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Again, more clinical symptoms and the details of each of those disorders can be found from professional organizations and clinicians. But those are the eating disorders that are most commonly heard about, talked about, experienced, and binge eating disorder is the most common one. Like all mental health disorders, unfortunately, there's so much shame and secrecy and stigma connected to eating disorders. I think we're making huge strides having events like Mental Health Awareness Month and this conference and so many others. I think is gradually helping to break that stigma, but it is still with us. And the more we talk and spread awareness and education, the more we can do to eliminate that stigma. So many people have that shame and secrecy, and there are so many people out there suffering with eating disorders who do not get the treatment that they deserve and that they need. So I want to now go into some of the details of my own journey. Again, I speak from my own personal experience with an eating disorder. And I will tell you that eating disorders, as I said, are not about the food, the behaviors with food, whether it's restricting, overeating, compensating, purging, whatever it is. Those are the symptoms of what's going on. And often eating disorders develop as a way of coping with stressors and challenges. It is a maladaptive way of coping with life, no different from substance abuse or alcoholism or other maladaptive ways of coping with life. Often an eating disorder develops as a way to numb difficult emotions. It is also a way of feeling a false sense of control. One may feel in control when they have an eating disorder, but it's actually the eating disorder that is in control. And now some more details about my own journey. I was born and raised in Rochester, New York, and my childhood was one of suburban privilege on many levels. And I'm very grateful for a privileged education, a roof over my head, enough food to eat, and overall, a wonderful daily life as a child. But my issues go back to my parents' divorce when I was 7 years old. Divorce is obviously so common, but back in the early 1970s, it was not. And my father was a well respected attorney in our community and walked out on my mom and me and my baby sister. And in those days, it wasn't as common. I felt like I was the only child in school whose parents were divorced. But what had the most profound impact on me was that my mom went on as if nothing happened. There was no place for discussion, emotions, sadness, anger, no place for emotions of any kind. My mom went on after this catastrophic loss of her marriage and life as she knew it, went on as if nothing happened. So it was modeled for me at a very young age that when something traumatic and difficult like this happens, we just stuff all the feelings inside. We don't identify them or articulate them or speak about them. We just go on as if nothing happened. So that set the stage for the rest of my childhood. And honestly, I believe that was the beginning of my anxiety and mild depression, though they were not diagnosed till I was in my 40s. So through the years, my mom became progressively more moody and rigid and controlling. She could be very loving, but I earned it early on that the way to make her happy, to truly feel loved, was to get good grades in school and do well on the tennis court. I'm grateful to my mom for helping me to pursue my dreams as a tennis player, and tennis was a huge piece of my life and intertwined with the best experiences and also with my eating disorder. And I'll talk more about that later. But I felt I had to be the perfect good girl, the perfect people pleaser. A perfect example was I did well in school. And if I got in the car after school and my mom would say, "How'd you do on that math test?" And I would say, "Oh, I did great. I got a 95." Instead of complimenting the good grade, she would say something like, "Well, do you understand the few things that you got wrong?" So I just always felt it, whatever I did, it was never good enough. But I knew it made her happy when I brought home good report cards and did well in all my tennis tournaments. And that I just kept it together. Fortunately, tennis gave me an outlet I otherwise would not have had. Hitting a tennis ball was certainly beneficial to me in getting out all those feelings I wasn't able to get in touch with. It also was a tremendous source of self-esteem. I became known in my community as a top junior tennis player. I was able to go on and play D1 college tennis. I was able to travel, make friends around the country. It really was a source of self-esteem. But my mother lived through that. She loved being my mom and getting all the positive attention as being the mother of a top junior tennis player. So I always felt I had to please her, win as many matches as possible, and be that good girl. I had no voice. I just had to go along, trying to meet my mom's expectations of perfection. She was so moody. At times I felt like I was walking on eggshells. She would get angry for no known reason. And it turns out she had undiagnosed mental health issues. And I think her moodiness and rigidity and controlling nature were a result of her own undiagnosed mental health issues. So I was fortunate to go on to college, 400 miles away from home, and play Division I college at a top university. But in college, my sophomore year, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she shared this news with me over lunch sophomore year when I came home from winter break. And instead of getting to talk about our fears and our emotions and just ask questions about her diagnosis and what would happen next, all she said was that she was having a mastectomy in a week or so. And after her surgery, she recovered and we went on as if nothing happened. This was the 1980s and there weren't, walks and awareness and celebrating survivors. She had this scary disease and we went on as if nothing happened. So again, that's what I learned how to do, and more emotions got stuffed inside. My father, my senior year, we were finally having a good relationship after years of not being closely connected. In those days, there wasn't the technology there is today to text or call or email on a frequent basis. It was sort of the once a week phone call after 5 o'clock when the rates went down. But in college, my last couple of years, I was sort of slowly starting to emerge from my mom's bubble. And my father made possible for me an amazing summer in Washington, D.C. And I started to become more independent. And the fall of my senior year, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, just as we were establishing a good relationship. Now, I thought this would be no different from my mom's diagnosis. She would have surgery and then we would go on with our lives. But unfortunately, my father's cancer was already in his liver and he was given a year to live. He ended up living 2 years, and I will always be grateful for that time that we had. He made it possible for me to move to Washington, D.C. after college and start my young adulthood. But my mother treated me as if I were divorcing her, just as my father had 14 years earlier. And this was another instant of what was later termed emotional abuse. Instead of being proud of me going off with my college degree to start my new career in Washington, D.C., my mom made me take everything from my room. It not only did I have to empty the desk drawers, I had to take everything except the furniture itself. My mother told me that if she couldn't have me around, she didn't want memories of me or reminders of me. It was like a knife to the heart. But again, I had no voice. I didn't know how to articulate or express difficult emotions. I stuffed it all inside. My father died about a year later, and I didn't know how to grieve. All I knew was to be grateful for the 2 good years I had with my dad. So that complicated relationship, a very difficult death, and grief I didn't even know how to begin to feel. My mom expected us to be positive all the time. I didn't know it was okay to feel all different types of emotions. I thought I had to be positive all the time. In fact, in going back and reading childhood diaries in preparation for writing my memoir, it's clear in my diaries, and I do have independent recollection of this. I felt guilty anytime I thought a negative thought. In my diaries, anytime I expressed something even slightly negative or difficult, I would follow it up with, but I love my life. I did not know I could be human and feel emotions. One of my very favorite quotes that I use in my memoir is about one of the most important pieces of my own recovery, and that was learning to be human and feel emotions. I haven't even gotten yet to the perfect storm, which led to my eating disorder diagnosis in my 40s, but I want to share this quote from Lori Deshane, and this has stuck with me throughout my recovery journey, and it's about feeling emotions. And this is something that was so far from the way I was raised, but this is a quote. You don't have to be positive all the time. It's perfectly okay to feel sad, angry, annoyed, frustrated, scared, or anxious. Having feelings doesn't make you a negative person. It makes you human. If only I had known that when I was growing up. So I'm going to skip over a lot of the details of my life and get to the perfect storm in my 40s. All the details of my life and the chapters I'm skipping over are in my memoir. But let's just say shortly after my father died, I went to law school. I met the man who would become my husband and moved to Rhode Island and had 3 wonderful children. They're all adults now. I've been married over 30 years. I'm so grateful. But anyway, in my 40s, when my youngest two were just starting school, my oldest was in high school, I got back into tennis. After 4 years of college tennis, I hadn't played in about 20 years due to law school, marriage, and 3 children, working as an attorney, mother of 3. I got back into tennis and it did wonders again for my self-esteem. It once again became my identity. I lost weight. I didn't need to lose about 10 pounds off my small frame. I got all these great compliments. You look great. You're such a good tennis player. And it made me feel really good about myself. And one thing led to another in the tennis world, and it opened up a lot of great opportunities for me, including my high school coaching career, which I just retired from last fall. I coached for 13 years, and I'm grateful for wonderful moments in my coaching career. But anyway, tennis became intertwined with my eating disorder. with all the positive compliments about my physique and my tennis, I began to have this very intense fear of gaining weight. Now, at the same time, I started having these episodes of significant shortness of breath. I had been so healthy my whole life and had never experienced any scary symptoms like this, but I was ultimately diagnosed with asthma. Now, I was someone who had never even liked to take an Advil for a headache, and here I had to manage a chronic illness, taking inhalers, learning about asthma. As someone with anxiety, I liked things to be black or white. I wanted someone to say, you take this inhaler and this will help your breathing, and then you go on with your day. But asthma was in the gray area. It was more like, well, let's try this inhaler. If it doesn't work, maybe we'll increase the dose or try a different one. That was very anxiety provoking for me. And feeling out of control with this new chronic illness I had to manage. That is when my anxiety was diagnosed. I was so anxious, not understanding the disease or how to manage it, and had so much to learn. And around the same time, I'd gotten back into tennis, and that had once again become my outlet and source of self esteem. Well, when I couldn't play tennis due to my asthma flare ups, I started restricting my food intake. It was a way of feeling in control when I felt so out of control. It was a way of coping with that intense fear of gaining weight. So the perfect storm in my 40s brought asthma, it brought tennis, but it also made me feel like a failure as a mom. At this point, I was so used to being an on the go mom, mother of three, taking care of all their needs. I didn't know how to rest. I didn't know self care was a thing. And I would get into what I called then these asthma funks when I felt so depressed, just on the couch, short of breath, not being able to play tennis, not being able to be the mom I was used to being. And at that point, my eating disorder, or Ed, as I like to call him, swooped in and took over and made me feel in control, helped me to numb those difficult emotions, to not feel the anxiety, the depression. I felt in control. It was the eating disorder that was in control. Now, a physician of mine, unrelated to this, had noticed the weight loss and actually called my primary care physician concerned. As a very small person, I'm only 5'2", 10 pounds lost in a short period of time was significant. My primary care physician wanted to make sure that I see a nutritionist to discuss the weight loss. And of course, I held on to that phone number for months. Why do I need a nutritionist? I'm fine. I didn't know there was anything wrong. I had those same preconceived notions that everyone else had. I couldn't have an eating disorder. I'm in my 40s. I'm not a young white female. I'm not emaciated. But at my very first appointment with my dietitian, I was diagnosed with anorexia. It was a shock, and that began my treatment journey. Now, my treatment was all outpatient. I saw a dietitian who specialized in eating disorders and a therapist who specialized in eating disorders. I kept my treatment outpatient, even though residential treatment or higher level of care was strongly recommended. Fortunately, I was medically stable throughout this time, and the choice was up to me. But again, I never knew that it was an option to prioritize me or my recovery. I couldn't disrupt my family life. I couldn't leave my children. I couldn't add to my work stress. So I continued with this outpatient recovery journey. But with so much shame and secrecy, I didn't know how to merge that journey with the parallel journey. And that was living my life as a mom, as a tennis coach, as a wife, all my activities. So on one level, I was the good girl, keeping my appointments, seeing my dietitian, seeing my therapist, and the other living the mom tennis life that I was used to living. Those two lines of my life did not merge till much later. And a lot of that was because of the shame and secrecy I felt. I wasn't comfortable sharing that I was struggling with an eating disorder because I had so much to learn about it myself, what would be required to recover from this eating disorder. And as I said earlier, the recovery journey is difficult. There's so many twists and turns along the way. There's so many steps backwards, and I experienced all this in my journey. So for about 6 or 7 years, I continued on this path. My dietitian started with a meal plan, and that is to take the power away from the eating disorder. That is telling the eating disorder, I have no choice. I have to follow my meal plan that the dietitian sets so that I can restore my weight. And once the weight is restored, that's when the really hard work of recovery begins. And for me, so much of that took place with my therapist. It was literally first understanding that my eating disorder developed as a maladaptive way of coping with stressors in my life. I learned that for 40 years, when I'd been internalizing any and all difficult emotions, the eating disorder was helping me to numb those feelings. Now, during those years that I did not go into detail about, my mom also passed away from her cancer 14 years after her diagnosis. And once again, I focused on the positive. I had 2 good years with her at the end of her life because she became a grandmother to my oldest. She died when my oldest, who's now 28, was 3 years old, and my daughter eased the tension between us. So again, my grief was not even, I didn't even know how to feel. I just thought I was supposed to focus on the 2 good years I had with each of my parents. My therapist in my recovery journey and my dietitian to an extent as well had to really get me to be vulnerable, to let my guard down, to let myself go back and feel all those difficult emotions. And it's not like that happens, in a few sessions, like, okay, today we're going to feel your mother's death and the grief that resulted. First, we had to talk about it all, talk through all these experiences. I had no idea that trauma could be emotional. I always focus on all the blessings in my life, and there were many that I'm so grateful for. But my therapist termed so many of the things that I went through with my mother as emotional abuse, and their difficult cancer deaths were emotional trauma. And the fact that I never coped with them in a healthy way, all these things contributed to the development of my eating disorder. Now, a word that I had always equated with weakness and was never allowed was essential to my recovery, and that word is vulnerability. It took a long time for me to let my guard down, to allow myself to be vulnerable with my professional treatment and start to tear down that wall brick by brick that I had put up around me. I'm strong, I'm positive, I can handle anything. Instead, I had to allow myself to be vulnerable, to talk about those difficult experiences and different challenges in my life and how I had suppressed emotions throughout my childhood and young adulthood. I didn't know I had needs of my own or that I was allowed to meet them. I was focused on meeting my mother's needs as a child and meeting my children's needs as an adult. I had to learn healthy ways of coping with life. Hitting a tennis ball wasn't enough. I had to get in touch with all those suppressed emotions. I had to learn that I could use my voice to ask for what I needed. And this was a long, difficult process. And it was not, there was no pivotal aha moment. It was just week after week, month after month, year after year of talking about my life and learning how and why I responded to the events in my life the way I did and talking about those. And so many times I would leave my therapist's office after a brief 45-minute session feeling like we just started to touch upon something, and I would get into my car and just sob. That was the hard work of recovery. It didn't necessarily always happen in the professional appointments. It happened afterwards. Sometimes something would be triggered and I would finally feel all those difficult emotions. It was heart-wrenching. It took so much out of me, but those were the keys to moving along in recovery. So for me, recovery was about restoring my weight and also feeling all those suppressed feelings. And some of the things that are really important along this process, besides feeling the feelings, besides allowing vulnerability, is learning to separate the eating disorder voice from the healthy voice. I learned in recovery that no one is born with an eating disorder. There is a healthy self in there, and it's digging deep to find that healthy voice to talk back to the eating disorder voice. So the eating disorder personified as Ed When Ed is saying, you can't eat that, you didn't exercise, the healthy voice in me needs to say, no, my organs need to eat even when I'm not exercising. I need to nourish my body with food every day at all times, regardless of how much I've exercised. So I had to learn that. The other important thing I had to do was learn to separate food from feelings. So many people are emotional eaters. They either eat or don't eat when they're feeling lots of emotions. I had to learn that no matter how I was feeling, no matter how anxious I was or sad I was, I still had to eat. Those behaviors had to be separate. Nourishing my body had to be separate from however I was feeling. I want to share with you another quote. This is a quote by an unknown author. I couldn't use it in my memoir because I learned through writing my memoir that to use quotes, you have to get permission from the author. Well, the author of this is unknown, but whenever I speak, I always share this quote because it really sums up for me in a lot of ways what I've learned in my recovery journey. And this is the quote. You fall, you rise, you make mistakes, you live, you learn. You are human, not perfect. You've been hurt, but you're alive. Think about what a precious privilege it is to be alive, to breathe, to think, to enjoy, and to chase the things you love. Sometimes there is sadness in our journey, but there is also lots of beauty. We must keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when we hurt, for we will never know what is waiting for us around the bend. End quote. I love that quote, and it sort of sums up for me where I am now. As I said, my message that I want anyone who reads my memoir or listens to me speak to learn is that it's never too late to be a work in progress. I will always be a work in progress. Food will always remain my medicine. And now it's the joy of discovery. Who am I without my eating disorder? I feel like that brick wall that I put up around me has come down, and now I'm free to use my voice, free to express my needs. Self-care is not selfish. I love the joy of discovery, of figuring out who I am without my eating disorder. It is never too late. So I did have an event about 6 years into my recovery journey that really helped me with sort of the last piece of recovery that is very hard for those who have struggled with an eating disorder to escape from, and that is body image issues. Even when someone's recovery is strong, the body image issues are one of the last things to go, because as we know, everyone has body image issues at times in their lives, even when they don't have a diagnosable eating disorder. But in 2017, and I write a whole chapter about this in my book, I had my own cancer scare. I was diagnosed with a tumor on my ovary that had to be removed in a complete hysterectomy. My anxiety was unbearable. I knew that cancer could happen even at a young age. Both my parents had died so young, my mom at the age of 60, my dad at the age of 56. Here I was in my early 50s. I wasn't one of those like, oh, it can't happen to me. It was the opposite. It's like, uh-oh, my turn. And I was terrified. I am so grateful to say that the tumor was benign, successfully removed, and for 2 months, I could do nothing but rest and recover from major surgery. And at no time during those 2 months did my eating disorder come back in and try and take over and make me restrict because I couldn't exercise. I could barely walk. So at that point, my recovery was very strong and I didn't have any setbacks eating disorder wise. But for 2 months, I really could do very little. But I knew I had to nourish my body with food so that I could heal from the trauma of major surgery. And I had to nurture my mind, my body, and my spirit to recover from this experience. Now, the euphoric gratitude for not having had cancer and surviving this scare led me to this profound appreciation for my health. When you have your health, you have everything. And I learned from that experience. It was a powerful reminder that I have one body and one body only, and I need to take care of it. I learned through that experience that I would never again deprive my body of what it wants. It was a reminder that even when I am sedentary, laying on a couch for 2 months, I still need to eat. It really showed how strong my recovery was, and it propelled my recovery forward. I was not going to deprive myself again. It was a reminder of how life can change in an instant, and it really cemented my recovery from my eating disorder. And soon after that, I had the opportunity to write my recovery story. This wasn't my memoir at this point. It was about my recovery from my eating disorder. And I had the opportunity to share it at treatment centers around New England. It was a very empowering experience. And I learned that my story could actually inspire others and help others. And again, I never planned to write my memoir, but when COVID hit in 2020, I had sort of just been starting with the thought or idea maybe this would be a long-term project that I would put my life story into words. And so I started writing literally in March of 2020 and finished my manuscript in January of 2021. My book was published in May and it's in paperback, ebook, and I just recently recorded my audiobook. I read my story over 5 days, about 2.5 hours a day as my story. I couldn't have anyone else read it. I read it myself. And so it's now available on audio, on Audible and Amazon. And I am just so grateful to be able to share my story with others. It's a privilege, it's empowering. And my goal of giving hope to others and inspiring others along their own journey is so meaningful for me, and my recovery gets stronger every time I share my story. But one thing I had to learn through recovery, and this is a very important point, is recovery is not all sunshine and rainbows. I did not make up that expression. It's one I've heard many times. I wanted to believe that once I achieved recovery, everything's great. This is good. The hard work paid off. But life is always going to be stressful. There are always going to be challenges in life. The key is not going back to my eating disorder as a way to cope. So much of recovery is about learning how to cope with the stressors in life in a healthy way. My therapist loves metaphors, and there's a metaphor that she used to sort of describe this, what I'm discussing, and that is a sailing metaphor. And the quote is a smooth sailor, a smooth sea. I have a bracelet that says it, but anyway, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. In other words, it's easy to sail when the water is smooth, but to be able to cope with the stormy seas, we need to learn to be a better sailor and learn better skills. So as life goes on and it is stressful and challenging, I have to learn healthy coping skills to cope. The skills you use on a smooth sea aren't going to work if the sea gets stormy. So some of those skills that I rely on now that I never would have been able to do before are connection. When life is stressful, connection is key. Reaching out for support, whether it's professional support, friends, family members, those with whom you can be your authentic, vulnerable self and admit that you are struggling. So connection is one of the important ways of handling life's challenges without going back to the eating disorder behaviors. Another thing is something we've already talked about today, and that is vulnerability, allowing myself to be vulnerable and admit that I'm anxious or stressed or scared, and not using the eating disorder behaviors as a way to cope, allowing myself to be vulnerable, to learn from what I'm feeling and take what I've learned in recovery to cope in a healthier way. I also learned that it's not enough to simply want recovery. Recovery requires a willingness to do whatever it takes, and that is allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to reach out for support. It's not enough to simply want recovery. We have to do the hard work of recovery. I had to feel my feelings. And I will say, in going back to writing my memoir, I gained a self-awareness through the process, going back and reading all these old diaries and journals from childhood and young adulthood. I felt like I was putting together a jigsaw puzzle of my own life, seeing how all the pieces fit together. that self-awareness was such a huge key to my recovery, understanding the experiences of my life and how they shaped me and how I responded when the way I did and why it might be helpful to focus on recovery and respond in a healthier way. Those are all important pieces of my life's puzzle. And I'm grateful to say I've learned so much from my experiences. And a metaphor I use that I want to end with before I open this up to questions is I liken my story now as if I have a backpack on, and throughout my whole life, that backpack was really heavy. There was always sadness, there was anxiety, mild depression. The way I responded to all the difficult experiences in my life, that backpack was heavy. But I'm happy to say now that backpack is a lot lighter. It's still there. My life experiences will always be a part of me. I wouldn't want it any other way. They make me who I am. But those difficult experiences no longer have the power over me that they once did. So that backpack, it's still on, but it's a lot lighter. And I am so grateful for my recovery journey. And that allows me now to have platforms like this and use my book as a framework for sharing my story, being my authentic self, and hopefully giving hope to and inspiring others who are struggling along their own journeys. And remember that recovery is possible. It is never too late to heal from past trauma and become healthier in body, mind, and spirit. I thank you for listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So there's one question we have from Chris Hope. He says, did you eventually tell your kids and husband about your eating disorder?
That's a really good question. And when I speak, that's usually the number one question. So when I was diagnosed with my eating disorder, my twins, who are now almost 20, they were in elementary school. They didn't really know what was going on. There was no need to share anything with them. I did share with my husband, obviously, the diagnosis, and he, like I, was shocked by the diagnosis. And we both had a lot to learn about eating disorders, and that it was an illness that was not my fault and what would be involved in recovery. Now, even with my own husband, I felt so much shame. I felt, this is my fault. I had to be reassured so many times that the eating disorder was not my fault. But I didn't talk about it a lot with my husband, even though he knew about my appointments and what I had to do to recover. The shame, it was really impactful in not allowing me to share as openly as would have been beneficial for both of us. My oldest, who's now 28 and married, she was in high school at the time, certainly sensed that I was struggling. And once again, I wasn't in a position where I was able to talk about it. We both struggled from anxiety and were triggered in different ways, and it manifested in different ways. It often led to battles between us, but neither of us really truly understood the big picture. But she certainly knew that something was going on. And I have to say, when my book came out a year ago, I was so grateful that my twins, who, like I said, are almost 20, were at an age where they could go back and learn everything. There were no secrets. I'm literally an open book. And so I was really grateful that they could read my words and learn everything that I wasn't able to share with them when they were younger. And even my oldest, just reading my chapters sometimes as I wrote them, just an incredible depth of understanding about my experiences. And my husband actually typed my entire manuscript. I wrote it the old fashioned way with pen and paper. So he read each chapter as he typed it after a long day of work. He can type so fast, he didn't even have to look at what he was doing. And there may have only been one typo. So my family has been a part of this process. They're grateful for my recovery as I am. It allows me to be fully present in my life and experience life to the fullest. But to go back to your original question, because of the shame, I wasn't comfortable talking about it with them early on. And, it was hard to hide it at times. But I'm grateful now that I am an open book and there are no more secrets or shame.
So from Beth Gaffett Tangwall, hope I'm saying your name right, asked is remind me of the title of your book.
My book is The longest match, rallying to defeat an eating disorder in midlife. And I had to go with a tennis theme, but instead of a tennis ball, it's actually a cupcake. Cupcakes were one of the first fear foods I learned to eat again in recovery. I used to bring a cupcake to my dietitian's office, and we would split it in two and each eat half of it, because when I was in the throes of my eating disorder wouldn't allow me to eat things like that. And because tennis has been intertwined in my life in such a positive way, but also with my eating disorder, it made sense to have a tennis themed title and cover. So it's The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife.
So there's another question from Chris.
Sure.
He asked, once you shared your eating disorder, did you think that helped you heal and feel your emotions and become whole?
Yes, but it was a process. It was definitely a process. And it wasn't until my recovery was stronger and I had that self-awareness of how my eating disorder developed, why it developed, and what purpose it served in my life. It was only then that I could begin to really heal and recover and get in touch with everything and move forward in recovery. I don't know if that answers your question. It's definitely not there's no simple answer to that. I would just say it was definitely a process.
I'm just trying to find a link for your book so I can put it in the chat.
Oh, thank you. It's on Amazon, and it's also in all formats. And then it's also locally in bookstores at Books on the Square on the east side of Providence.
All right, I'm going to share it real quick.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I literally went from being such a private person to being an open book. There are no secrets. And if you had told me a few years ago that that would be the case, I would have said, no way. I was always the one that was a listening ear for others. I'm fine. I'm fine. I want to help others with their struggles. And now every detail of my life is in print. And I can tell you the one word that comes to mind from that is freedom. I never thought I could feel so free to be my authentic self, free to use my voice, ask for what I need, engage in self-care. All these things were so foreign to me. And the freedom that writing my memoir and healing on the deepest level possible has given me, I will always be grateful for this next chapter. Are there any other questions?
No. No more questions.
Well, again, I'm honored to have been here today to talk about eating disorders in general and share my own story, my journey to healing. It's never too late to be a work in progress. And it's just an incredibly empowering, impactful experience for me to be able to share my story and answer questions. So thank you so much for listening.
Well, thank you, Betsy, for doing this.
My pleasure.
Oh, one more question.
Oh, sure.
And it's from Chris again. I think it's Chris. Do you think the cancer scare changed you?
I wouldn't say it changed me, but it had a profound impact on me. It just was this powerful, and I can't underestimate the impact, this powerful reminder of how quickly life can change and the gratitude I felt that it wasn't cancer. And it just gave me this tremendous appreciation for my health and what my body can do when it's healthy. Was back on the tennis court after 2 months, and it just felt so good knowing that I was healthy and could do the things that I loved. So it was a very impactful experience. I wouldn't say it changed me as a person, but it propelled my recovery, which was already strong at that point, even further.
Thank you for being here, Betsy.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone.
All right, take care.